Some of you might have noticed a little flu going around Europe, causing some governments to take light precautionary measures and others to force a complete standstill of all public life. And with good reason. Over 30,000 people in Europe alone have died from this virus. Starting in Italy and Spain, it spread like wildfire across Europe. With free movement of people, work, capital and goods, this is hardly surprising. However, it did seem to come as a surprise for the EU. At the start of the outbreak, there was little lockdown coordination, no mass organized EU support, and no standard on tracking the pandemic. This hasn't gone by unnoticed by the media, and fortunately the EU has since then changed gears. Still, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union provides the EU with all the necessary legal tools to give widespread support from day one. And that's exactly what a pandemic of this magnitude needs: coordination, support, standardization, centralization of information, material, but most of all, being prompt and fast. Now, through this video, I'd like to structure what could have been an alternative EU comprehensive pandemic response plan. So let's get at it and start with the first measure: support. That the Union is able to support its member states with preemptive measures is proven by its ability to deploy 60,000 military personnel to defend Europe. Unfortunately, nothing similar exists against pandemics, floods, eruptions, and wildfires. As such, one of the first EU additions should be, in analogy of the Rapid Reaction Force, a Rapid Medical Response Team. This team should be deployable in the EU in less than 48 hours and include mobile hospitals, protective gear, doctors and nurses, basic medicine, and all necessary material. The purpose of this rapid response team is to preempt overwhelming local healthcare and avoiding at all costs that people die because of lack of care. To be able to correctly assess where and when support is needed, the EU requires information, and that brings us to the second measure: the standardization, centralization, and accessibility of information. In the past week, nearly every European has become a statistician, designing graphs, interpreting data, and making predictions on how the pandemic will evolve. Unfortunately, the quality of the data they use was lacking. Infection data depends on testing frequency and the methodology used, which were different per country. Same problem persists when analyzing casualties. Italy included in their casualty report every deceased person who was infected with the virus, whether they died from it or not, while the Netherlands only included victims that died in hospitals. Valuable data, like hospitalized patients and the numbers on intensive care, were less accessible. The EU also ought to have its own sophisticated centralized database and a trustworthy citizens' pandemic information platform. Currently, nearly every European news agency is dependent on US sources. That standardized data is important becomes clear in the third measure: identifying regions and zones to better direct efforts and implement a targeted response. South Korea efficiently dealt with the outbreak partly due to pinpointing exactly where outbreaks happened. They tested extensively, tracked those who were infected, and took targeted measures. Conclusion: they took control over the pandemic faster than any other country, with very few victims and without needing to close down the whole country. Europe can apply South Korea's tactic by pre-identifying regions, following up the infection rate in these regions, and take pre-agreed measures when these regions surpass a certain infection threshold. This will allow the EU and its member states to react preemptively and control the spread. To be able to pull off something like that, the EU will need to act as a coordinator between all member states. And this brings us to the measure of procedures and protocols. Before a pandemic were to even start, processes and procedures would already need to be written out, tested, communicated, and on standby. Ideally, from the moment a pandemic becomes a reality, the EU can activate procedures and protocols with a simple push of a button. All this can only be done with the necessary tools though. South Korea has proven that the tools exist. The EU just needs to acquire these expertise and technology to make sure the next time they not only have the right procedure, but the technology and tools to support these procedures. Finally, a hospital network that tracks all the registered hospitals in the European Union based on their capacity, such as beds, respirators, ICU beds, doctors, nurses, material, and so on. This would allow the European Union to know which hospitals have capacity left or which ones are close to have no more material or equipment.